And don't be like Sam Altman.
don't be like Sam Altman. I think that's a great alternative tagline. Maybe that'll be the title for this episode.
Right.
We'll see. This is Philosophy Programs and Prompts, a podcast where two real humans made a really long podcast and had to split it into two. I'm Casey Hart.
And I'm Carl Brown.
And this is us kind of from the future, interspliced in. We did in our last episode a awesome conversation about what happened with OpenAI and Hugging Face, and Carl illuminated me about that. And now we are going to continue into talking about Hank Green and the controversy with him just responding to a little bit of pushback. Okay, well, let's say what we do think about Hank Green a little bit and why he qualifies for the second scandal in this scandal podcast. Maybe I'll just say quickly, Hank Green I owe him a lot in terms of he's certainly a large part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast today and why I stuck with and decided like where my YouTube channel is personally. And that is because months and months ago, I had a friend from college who sent me like a Facebook message saying, hey, you should do something on this Nate Sora's Hank Green interview. I think it's kind of in your wheelhouse. It's like, okay. So I made that video saying that they were crazy and too negative towards philosophy and a host of other things. Go watch the video if y'all want to. But as a result of that video, somebody else was like, hey, Casey, you'd really like this Carl guy's channel. You guys there's something about the two of you. And I sent you a message, and then, you guys can go listen to the first episode of this podcast series if you want. But that was sort of the origin story of me spending more time talking about these topics and doing this podcast as well. So we're talking about Hank Green here. I'm appreciative of the content that he's put out and the role that has played in my life.
Well, that video of yours was the first thing I remember popping up on my feed with your face in it. And it had Hank Green's face in it. And I was like, okay, well, let me go look at this. And so that was my first exposure to you, I think. And then we ended up collaborating on some things and having some conversations. So I mean, to the extent that yes, we wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for Hank Green. I still think the world would probably have been better off if he had not had that interview platforming that crazy doomer scenario. But
you can say Nate Sora's his name recognition is not going to go up too much from this channel.
Well, I don't think that platforming him was the problem so much as lending a lot of credence to the ridiculous, crazy scenario that underlines, if anyone builds it, everyone dies, or, AI 2027 or any of that other doomer crap.
Yeah. Totally agree with that. We'd want to, and this maybe gets to where what I was trying to bring across here. I don't think that either of us are like, we're not majorly anti Hank Green. We're not like saying that he has no value or he's not very good. In fact, because he has so many virtues as a content creator and is so good at what he does, that has gotten him the sort of soapbox and ability to put his thumb on the scale and really affect the way a lot of people think about certain issues. And it's just with great power comes great responsibility kind of thing. Yeah. Maybe I should say briefly, okay, what is the scandal? If some of you out there have been living under a rock or something, or also just normal and not caught up into this sort of YouTuber drama, I don't think this is all that widespread. Like, I'm sure my wife has no idea that this was a thing that's happened. So Hank had a video where when he was talking, he said, I appreciate the pushback. And it seemed almost like it was relatively innocuous unless you are also terminally online in some other ways. And you're like, wait, I appreciate the pushback. Isn't that a LLMism, like that's a kind of ChatGPT sort of phrase. I think it's ChatGPT, right? That's the LLM that has it. Again, I don't even know that. But some people hear that phrase and say, think Hank is using LLMs as a script generator, or to what degree is he doing that? And then there is pushback and scandal ensuing, and people talking a lot about like, oh, was he doing too much? Was he violating the community's trust? There's backlash, and that is spawned how many videos? I've seen at least 15
dozens
videos.
At least.
Yeah, tons of folks talking about this as a topic for like how should we be dealing with it?
Yeah, and most of them are not coherent. I would say a lot of them are just kind of piling on, without much, rigor or thought behind it.
But let's hope we're an exception to that.
Well,
let us know in the comments if we are contributing to clarity or just trying to put his face on another thumbnail to try and ride his coattails.
Yeah, I mean, so when this first happened, my initial reaction was, okay, because it's obvious that the clip in which he says, "I appreciate the pushback," came out of another video, right? He's doing something and then he cuts to that and then he goes through that part and then he cuts back, right? Because he's describing this, he's basically using that as part of an explanation for a longer conversation he's having. And I figured it was just the conversation that he'd had that he'd cut that out of was a conversation with someone, and they had pushed back on him and he had put that in there. And when he cut it out, he didn't, he left that piece in, and I expected he would just post the longer conversation that shows where the pushback actually came from. And that was, whatever. That's not what happened. He basically did this long mea culpa thing, talking about how that his brother and his wife had both agreed that his use of LLMs was not, or ChatGPT was not healthy or something to that effect.
Yeah. He apologized, and here I'll just read a quote from his statement, and we can link to the statement below. But he said, "But mostly I need to come to terms with the fact that the level of dopamine I've been getting from interacting with LLMs, with doing more and more and more and more, is not healthy for me or good for the world." So it was not a, like, hey, I kind of went overboard there or something like that. Like that has more of a, there was an intervention, and like,
right.
that's what you say when you're like, I'm sorry, I've been drinking too much, right? Like that was the kind of tone to it. Not trying to like over, moralize or anything right here. But like you said, there are a number of responses Hank could have had, and a lot of them could have like crushed the story. But I think that apology and taking it seriously and saying, I need to step back on a couple of these channels and acknowledge that I've been getting too much of a rush, made it more of a conversation.
Right. And it's kind of sad because I think in that case, at least presuming the underlying reality is what it seems like it is, given that apology, it sounds like he did the right thing, but it made the online conversation a lot worse. So it's kind of unfortunate that, there are times that, you doing the right thing isn't always the thing that leads to the easiest outcome for the person doing the right thing, right?
I think we should I think we should probably talk a bit more about Hank, like in terms of what we think his strengths and weaknesses are, because that is going to inform to what degree we think it's a problem that he used LLMs. And my general take is that he is, like, his best attribute, like, he seems to have a real joy for learning and for like, I found this cool fact and I can't wait to share it with you. And like, there's a contagious nature there that is incredibly good. But that is exactly the kind of thing that can get someone in hot water, because they can learn a new thing and like not have a fully baked idea of it, but just be so excited to push that sort of knowledge that they've gained along. And one thing that I've come across when I see some of the reaction videos, I don't know if you've seen this one, I'll try and find the link so we can drop it below as well. was someone from like the knitting and weaving community,
Right.
which YouTube has. One thing I love about YouTube is you get there are all these crazy different communities that it's a place for people to gather. But they're like, oh, we had an issue with this 6 months ago when Hank did some video about the weaving community, and we found it to
It was
be
knitting.
it was knitting. Well, they
Yes.
talked about weaving and knitting, and weaving was like sort of better. There's like potentially some misogyny and stuff in there. I don't need to unpack all of this, but just to say that when you see someone in a specific community that sees then whenever Hank talks about their stuff, they have an issue, right? That makes me think that like, oh, wait, should we maybe not think that any of the issues that he talks about are actually being as faithfully or correctly represented as I kind of wanted to think.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so let me kind of place myself in this miasma. So I've gotten tagged into several of the things about him. So once upon a time, SciShow, and we should make a distinction between the things that Hank has done on his own and the things he has done as part of SciShow, right? And the knitting video was a SciShow video. And those arguably should be held to a higher standard. Theoretically, there's like a whole research team behind them and that kind of thing. And I'm not really one to speak to the specific knitting things, except for, as I'll say in a second. But SciShow did another video that was sponsored by one of these AI think tank groups that is funded by a lot of the same people that fund OpenAI and Anthropic and that kind of thing, right? That are pushing for the idea that AI is basically going to kill everybody and pushing this statement that AI is a global level threat, and specifically not pushing a statement that AI companies should be held accountable for the things that their AIs do. Right?
Yeah.
And in this video that SciShow did, that Hank was narrating, they made some statements about how AI supposedly had advanced faster than any other human technology, even nuclear bombs. Right. And that's just not true. There are some very specific ways that you can define the beginning of AI and the beginning of, or the current state of AI, specific events that you can like say, okay, well, if we count the beginning of AI as this point and the end of AI is this point, right? And if we count the beginning of the atomic bomb as this and then this one's longer than that one, right? I mean, it's like, but for virtually any measure that makes any sense at all, the difference between, okay, we started messing with atomic stuff and, okay, we had a bomb and okay, we had power plants, which we actually had atomic power before we had atomic bombs, because that's how anyway. So I made a video that was basically like, this SciShow video is crap. There's lies in it. There was a previous SciShow video about the Manhattan Project that shows that that the information that was available to show that was a lie, SciShow had. Right. This is garbage, right? So I posted this video. It went kind of viral. I got an email personally from Hank. And he and I went back and forth, and I'm not going to go through a lot of the individual conversation because it was a private conversation, but what he wanted me to understand, and what I began to understand as I started reading the comments, was that the video I had created, rather than creating the impression that this AI nonprofit had basically paid SciShow to make a video that was basically propaganda for the AI industry. what that video that I made was taken as was evidence that SciShow was going downhill. And it got combined with some mistakes that were made in this video about knitting. There were some other mistakes in some videos that had been made not too long before. And so my video, basically, the comments of my video were not about, the way they're treating AI is wrong and AI companies shouldn't be paying for this. It was, SciShow sucks now, Hank Green sucks now, these people aren't doing research anymore, yada, yada, yada. And so that was not the message I was wanting to get across. I have a lot of respect for SciShow. I have respect for Hank too, but I especially have a lot of respect for SciShow and for Complexity and Crash Course and a bunch of the other things they're trying to do.
Right.
And so I withdrew that video. I made another version of it that talked about the video that SciShow had made, but also brought in a bunch of other YouTubers who had done sponsored videos with the same kind of, I would say, propaganda in them, to make it less about SciShow and less about Hank, and more about the message I was trying to get across. And some people saw that as, me giving in or whatever, and that's fine. You can believe whatever you want to believe on that. But what that did for me is that made me look at what Hank does and what SciShow does with the understanding that there's a particular kind of, it's a phrase with Gell-Mann amnesia or Gell-Mann amnesia or something like that. So the idea where, the idea where when you see a news report, you tend to think that the news report would be correct. Except every once in a while, you'll see a news report that's about something that you're an expert in. That's what you do for a living. And you'll be like, well, that's complete crap. But then you don't extend that to say, well, if the thing that was in my wheelhouse was complete crap, probably everything else is complete crap too. And what I have, learned is that the way that Hank, to some extent SciShow, but especially Hank, has talked about AI over the last year or two has been very uncritical. It's been very sycophantic. He's been one of the voices outside the AI industry that has done a lot toward pushing credibility of a lot of the narratives, like the doomer narrative, that I consider harmful. And that has really bothered me quite a bit. He has done some things. Luckily, he did at one point on his channel platform, I want to say his name's Cal Newsom. He's a professor. He does his,
Newport.
That sounds better.
Yeah.
So Hank had him on his channel to kind of provide an alternative. It was way later than he had the Nate Soares, if anyone builds it guy. And the video didn't do nearly as well, but at least he did platform some people that weren't in that sycophantic kind of, mind frame. But it did make me really concerned about the message that people were taking away from what Hank was saying and what SciShow was saying about AI. And I think to some extent it actually went some distance toward, extending the bubble, however long the bubble continues to be before it pops. And, honestly, there are people that are being harmed. There are people that are being laid off, not because the AI can do the work that they do, but because their bosses believe that the AI will be able to do the work that they do either now or sometime in the near future. And by having people that are credible like Hank Green that say things like, AI is only ever going to get better, then, that really feeds into the narrative that these, the business people are using to decide, who not to hire and who to lay off and that kind of stuff. And there are real people that are getting hurt by that. And I find it very unfortunate.
100% agreed there. So if I was just going to try and put a bow on how we feel about, Hank in particular, right, and how this stuff has happened, there's a lot of laudable traits in terms of the content that he's created, but this is kind of feeding into a broader trend that we've seen of, as if we try and be more careful about some of the claims, maybe there's less there than we thought previously, and the kind of response that he had, which again really sounds like someone admitting some sort of addiction or something like that, not trying to over medicalize it,
Right.
but that fits in a certain narrative arc there. Now, I have listened to a number of other YouTube videos about the Hank Green apology and what to think about this sort of thing. So many of them that I was almost like, maybe we shouldn't do one, because like I don't want to just like throw another log on that same fire. But one of the reasons I wanted to do it, a couple that we'll get to, but as you mentioned earlier, I don't think the discussion is very clear about, okay, so what is it supposedly? Yes, there's some backlash, but is there anything to that backlash? Is there something wrong that he was doing? Even if we just like, we could take for granted, let's just say that entire video was scripted by an LLM. Let's say like the most extreme view. What would be bad or wrong about that? Why? What is the problem? So I listed a couple of things here, and I kind of want to go back and forth with you and see what you think about these as the explanation for what went wrong. And the first thing in the content creation world is viewers didn't like it. So if your viewers don't like something, it's bad, right? Like we give the people what they want. How does that strike you as an explanation for what was bad here?
Well, I mean, yes, but that's not really actionable, right? I mean, it's really hard to be like trying to predict exactly what the audience is going to want or not want is to some extent a fool's errand, right? It's like you never know. And a lot of times what happens, how people respond often will depend on how the early responses manage to go viral or not, or whatever, right? I mean, the whole, the similar incidents have happened, and one of them, somebody said something snarky about it that went viral, and one of them it didn't. And, there's no real reason that one of those blew up the way and the other one didn't, but that happens sometimes, right? So, I mean, it's great to say, well, what he did is he did something that the audience didn't like, but like, that's not an actionable thing that you can use to try to decide what content you are or you're not going to do. It's not really that useful. Yes, you want to do what your audience is going to like, but that's not necessarily always clear what that's going to be.
Good. And another reason why I bring this up first is I think part of the unclarity is like, what is the nature of the mistake, the wrongness? So one thing that you could point to is that it's like a practically bad idea for Hank to be creating videos with LLMs because his audience won't like it. But it could also be that we want that it's a morally bad thing or that it's a legally bad thing, right? There's lots of different lenses we can use to evaluate whether how one ought to act. It's ought legally, ought morally, ought spiritually, ought insert your domain here, right? And the other thing that I think is missing on the unpopularity view is it's derivatively unpopular. Like the real reason that it's unpopular is because people are going to think something else went wrong, right? If you do something that is dishonest, then it might be unpopular because lying to people is not a popular thing to do. Politicians notwithstanding. So that's the second thing I wanted to raise here, which is maybe that's what's going on. Like, is the problem with using LLMs that there is something dishonest about him doing that? How do you feel about that as an explanation?
So, okay, so I would not have a problem with, well, I personally, so, okay, back up. So I saw one video where what they were doing, I don't remember the channel, but basically they like gathered a bunch of people around the room that were of different generations. And they were like, okay, what do you think? Is this good or bad, or, red or green or whatever, right? And it was like this big, generational kind of, oh, that's bad, and no, I have a problem with it, and that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of different opinions on this for a lot of different reasons. There's the so if he had a stated policy or whatever, right? And what he had done was contrary to that policy, right? Then there's definitely some amount of distrust there, right? And part of the problem is that Complexity, the company that he started, that he's now stepped back away from, but he still does work for, the company that owns, SciShow and Crash Course and all that, they do have a clear AI policy. And if I appreciate the pushback line was created by an LLM, then that would have meant that the video that he created would have been a violation of that policy. His initial response, which I think was on Twitter, said that he had looked at the scripts and that none of the scripts had the I appreciate the pushback line in them. So it wasn't the case that he was just reading what the LLM had said. I've seen a lot of people that were very skeptical of that because it seemed like a line that just kind of came out of nowhere. And so I think part of the reaction from people is to be like, well, the viewing audience, have not gotten an explanation that sounds credible about why that phrase was in there. Right. And you saying, I just ad-libbed it in the middle of a conversation I was having with just the camera, and there was no pushback there. Like, what, give me a reason why that would be the case. And I haven't seen an explanation for that. And I have seen people complaining that there hasn't been an explanation for that. So I think that's part of the trust thing, is there's the inciting incident asks a question of, where did this phrase that does not sound like it ought to have been there come from? And it doesn't seem like people have gotten an answer, or at least not a satisfactory answer. And I think a lot of people are concerned about that. And that has led to a bunch of other, ripples of dissatisfaction and, lack of trust and that kind of thing.
Yeah, good. There's so much in, dishonesty camp here. You pointed to one thing, which is if I have a contract or something, a stated policy, and I violate that, that's essentially a broken promise, right? That's a form of dishonesty. There might be dishonesty that you're worried about in terms of LLMs more broadly, if you think that they're not accurate ways to convey information, that if I know you're relying on those, then I think it's more likely that you're just presenting me with falsehoods. And that's a sort of dishonesty. There might be dishonesty in terms of when you present material, right? We're having this conversation right now. It should be coming from Casey and Carl. It looks like it's coming from the two of us. And if it really was just us, asking Gemini, what should we say about this? Then you guys can make your own podcast at home by asking Gemini to make a podcast for you, which is reminiscent of, I think it was Sam Altman somewhere recently said, I've got a good idea for how you can use Chat GPT to talk to your kids, which is make a podcast about your kid's life while you drive in the car. That's great. Again, apparently I am way too online. I shouldn't know those things. But dishonesty, I think, does do a lot of the explaining here. And if you are being dishonest, not only is there a good case that is morally wrong, right? But that violates the trust with the audience. And that's the kind of thing that can lead to the sort of, unpopularity that we've got here. On the explanation front, though, given the other things that he's said, I don't find it that hard to believe that he authentically said, authentic might be wrong, he really ad-libbed, appreciate the pushback. Because as someone who has just been listening to a bunch of stories about this, I was recording another video a couple days ago, my video on chapter 1 of the Soros-Yudkowsky book. And it's a dialectical thing where I'm like, they say this, I say this, and And I can't tell you how many times I was like, here's their argument. But if I wanted to push back against that, I could not stop myself from saying pushback. It was impossible. I may have said it several times earlier on in this podcast for the same reason, which is to say that if Hank really is using LLMs a lot, like engaging in a lot of ChatGPT conversations, and it says, I appreciate the pushback a lot, that's just a phrase that is in his head and, on the tip of his, like, he might legitimately say that out of nowhere.
Arguably, wouldn't that be worse though?
Oh, I think so. I think it is a problem. I think that's another thing we can point to that might be wrong with this sort of thing. But absolutely, if the question is, how would you end up saying that? You could say, well, it wasn't dictated to me there, but it's like we all have those friends that when we hang out around those friends, we start talking differently. Some people, that is what ChatGPT is, right? That is what Gemini is. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. That is problematic in different ways. And that's where, like, this dishonesty, and I think you did a nice job of linking that with trust. There is a sense of, like, and what I said that I think Hank is best at, right, is he comes across as like a sincere lover of knowledge and facts and science. And that there's an authenticity there that is what he is selling. And if we find out that it's really a packaged LLM or is being sort of infiltrated with, LLMs are nothing if not distilling things down and homogenizing things, right? I would feel like, oh, wait, you've lost that authentic voice. I'm not getting your enthusiasm anymore. I'm getting a conversation that you have with a chatbot. That's not the kind of thing that I want to listen to.
Yeah, and you're talking to me as if you would talk to a chatbot, or you're talking to me as if a chatbot is talking to you. That's not the perspective that I want, right? If I wanted to know what a chatbot thought about this, I would go ask a freaking chatbot. I have access to lots of chatbots. They've seen to that. What I'm here for when I'm watching, Hank's channel or SciShow or listening to a podcast for the most part, or that kind of thing, is, I want to know what the thoughts and experience and life lessons of the person speaking has to say on the particular topic that they're discussing. I don't want the groupthink of what OpenAI would say or what ChatGPT would say about this particular topic. That's not, like I said, if I wanted to know that, I would just ask ChatGPT myself. And so to the extent that you think that you're hearing someone's actual experience when in fact you're hearing what ChatGPT has to say is means to some extent you're wasting your time listening to them when you could just, either go ask ChatGPT or decide that, you didn't really want to know that anyway, because all you're going to get is what ChatGPT would have told you.
Yeah. Okay. So we have, maybe it's the popularity, which I don't think that's what we think it is so much, or at least only derivatively so. Something about authenticity and honesty or lying, I think, is a really important explanation of what's gone wrong here, if something has. Then the third thing, which you might be pointing to, is just like a general reduction in quality.
Right.
Maybe that's tied into the authenticity, but maybe it's just, it's turned a gourmet meal into fast food or something like that. It's not giving me the same quality I wanted.
Or at least a reduction in perspective.
Yeah.
Right. So even if it's a gourmet meal, right? If you have the same meal every meal, right, you're going to get tired of it and you're going to want something else. And when you have a number of voices that you're listening to in podcasts and on YouTube and that kind of thing, right? You want each of them to come from their own place, right? And if we're going to be, intelligent consumers of information and we're going to make up our own minds, we need to understand what piece of information did we get from what places? What are the biases and perspectives and life experiences of those different places? And then what should I take from that? And what should I decide is right for me and the decisions I'm making in the situations that I'm in, right? And if it turns out that underlying all of or many of the different things that I think are different perspectives is all just people reading ChatGPT to me, right, then the breadth of facts that I think I'm getting are not actually as broad as I thought.
And like that sense of diversity is why we decided to make our own podcast, because we're like, we need two white guy Americans to have their own podcast. That's an underrepresented voice. But no,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, you're right and being sarcastic, the two white guys make a podcast is a very a really, really common trope. But we are actually trying to bring our specific perspectives and the interaction of our specific perspectives to the issues that we talk about, right? And if we were using, and we're not, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but if we were using LLMs and we were just reading off of a ChatGPT script, right? I would say that this podcast would have no value and you shouldn't be listening to it, right? I mean,
absolutely. Yeah. And again, maybe this is where I should have been like clear in my head about enumerating these reasons, but what you were just saying really ties into the next one that I put down, which is that use of artificial intelligence can create additional biases and blind spots. Like part of the downside of the homogeneity, right, is I'm missing these other perspectives, these other angles, and so I'm not seeing them. And there was a recent story in the news, we'll link below in the description, but DropSite presented this about how Israel was part of the, I don't remember what it was, APAC in particular, but or part of their foreign policy for trying to engender international trust. Instead of just lobbying federal governments, they were like, oh wait, actually we should also just build websites that have, in general, pro-Israel information on them and try and get those websites to be part of the training data sets for various LLMs. This is, there's, as Google rose to prominence, SEO became a more and more important sort of thing. And now we're doing that same sort of thing with large language models. How can we get our data, our perspective in high up in these LLMs? And of course, that means people who are consuming LLMs to learn things. Like, there's a lot of information there, but you are also consuming some stuff that has been fed in by various sources, and you might be missing out some other perspectives of the folks that aren't able to pay for their own websites to get put into the training data set. Right?
Yeah, I went to a conference, I don't know, a month ago maybe, here in Austin. That was a conference for like creators and brands and sponsorships and that kind of thing. And one of the big topics of conversation was basically, how do brands get ChatGPT to recommend their product? And there were lots of discussions about that and lots of strategies. And some people call it, I don't remember what they stand for. We'll stick them in the show notes. But some people call it GEO. Some people call it AEO, to correspond to SEO, which was search engine optimization. And there's a cottage industry that is growing by leaps and bounds of people trying to figure out how to manipulate these LLMs in order to produce the information that they want to have produced in the event that people ask particular questions. And I'm sure that's not going to stop. On top of that, you have that the AI companies themselves, in the process of training these LLMs, have existing biases that get trained into the LLMs, either deliberately or because the only kinds of people that would work at an AI company are people that are pro-AI. And so obviously pro-AI, biases are going to leak into the output of the AIs, right? And so, if you're a neutral third party, if you're a science educator on the internet, right, and you use an LLM in order to help educate you on AI specifically, right, you are far more likely to treat it the way the AI companies and the AI industry would want you to treat it, relative to how a skeptic or an actual neutral third party who's not getting most of their information from the AI industry would treat it. And I find very disconcerting, because AI is, I mean, this is part of my existing biases, but I think it's one of the more important issues that we're dealing with as a society right now, in a lot of different ways. And when you have people who are purporting to be educated, independent purveyors of their unfiltered, educated opinion about these things, and it turns out that they've actually been spending so much time talking to the chatbots that they've started just using chatbot speak, in their everyday vocabulary. That I find really disconcerting, because I think we should have a lot more skepticism about AI than we actually do. And the more people out there that are knowingly or unknowingly parroting back what the AI companies are wanting people to believe, the more problematic it is, in my mind, at least.
Yeah, very much on board with that. And to be clear, I'm not saying, even in like all the discussion that we've had here, it's not obvious to me whether Hank did anything morally wrong or like how serious the wrongness was. But I think when we discuss, was there anything wrong? First off, I want to say I don't think it's clear, and I don't think it is just like inherently morally wrong to use artificial intelligence, or even inherently practically wrong. Instead, I think we can point to the other things, like lying is wrong, right?
Right.
Being dishonest is wrong. Breaking your promises is wrong. Producing bad quality stuff, I think, is wrong. We can argue whether it's morally wrong or just, bad practice or something like that. So when you're thinking about, should I be using AI for these things, you should refer back to those other things and say, well, am I running afoul of those other issues, right? If Hank was clear that he said, hey, part of this script was formed by my conversation with ChatGPT, nonetheless, I, feel like I contributed my own thoughts to it. I don't have enough time to get something else out, and right now, I think it's something the world needs to hear. That might still be problematic for other reasons, but it wouldn't have been dishonest.
Right.
So our criticisms kind of have to like actually evaluate the sorts of actions that we think are good or bad and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, so there are people that are, no one, or maybe not no one, but you, whoever you is, shouldn't use AI under any circumstances because it's not ethical, and I shouldn't use it because it's unethical, yada yada yada, right? What I will say to that is that there is this desire on behalf of a lot of people to shift societal responsibility to individual responsibility, right? We have this idea that was, from what I understand, started by the fossil fuel industry, of the idea of an individual carbon footprint. The idea being, if all of the individuals were really, really careful about their carbon footprint, then we wouldn't have a climate change problem, right? When in fact, if all of us were very, very careful about our carbon footprint, we still wouldn't really make a dent in the industrial uses of carbon that the idea of a carbon footprint ignores, right?
Yep.
There's an extent to which arguing that individuals should be responsible for their use of AI because AI is unethical moves the impetus of the intellectual property theft away from the companies that actually did the thieving and onto the individuals that do or do not use the end product, right? And so, I'm not going to buy the argument that the responsible parties for all of the intellectual property theft are the people that are using the AIs, right? the companies that stole all that information and used it without permission, they should be responsible, right? They should be required to pay whatever is fair for having stolen that information. But it's not my responsibility, and it's not the viewer, the listener's responsibility to withhold your use of the AI in order to try to punish the AI company or something like that, because that's not actually going to help.
I think I'm gonna have to push back a little bit on you there. I agree with the sense that systemic changes are more important here. So maybe I just agree with the most important thing about the sentiments, but nonetheless, I think individuals have responsibility on that front as well. For me, it's just a practical difference about who I'm going to spend my time like trying to blame people for things. But in the same sense that like it's, I think, morally impermissible to eat factory farmed meat, right? I think the best way for us to make changes so that there is less, inhumane treatment of animals is through like social processes, right? Government policies, those sorts of things.
Right.
Nonetheless, if you give me a burger where like this animal was really tortured before it was killed or something like that, I do think I still have a moral responsibility to not partake in that sort of suffering. So I feel like there's both there.
I mean, sure. So, if your worldview says that, partaking in any way of the fruit of the poison tree, as they say in legal circles, is, unethical, then sure, I'm fine with that, right? You've made you've put a moral stake in the ground, or you've put you've made a decision about how you want to live your life, and you're living in accordance with that decision. I'm fully supportive of that. That's great, right? But the idea that you, or you, Casey, or Hank Green, or me, Carl, or whatever, are unethical because we're using AI, because the AI was trained on stolen information, right? I'm not on board with that particular chain of reasoning.
Okay.
If you use it if you use it without disclosing it, that's different, right? But the idea that any person who makes use of this technology that was based on stolen information is themselves responsible for the fact the information was stolen, I don't think we're responsible for that. I think that the companies ought to pay some amount of however much money those companies make should go to the people that created the stuff that it was trained on. And it's not, not everyone who uses the tool is evil.
Oh, yeah. On board with you there. Or at least we're all evil for different reasons. Right. I mean, whole bunch of interesting directions that we could take that conversation about moral responsibility, and whether it's sort of like a finite pie that gets sliced up, etc. But rather than get too much into those weeds, I kind of want to end with something a little more practical here, and also just sort of disclosing, which is to talk about how we actually use AI, like ourselves on our individual channels, and maybe have a philosophy programs and prompts board meeting live on the podcast to see, like, are we cool with that, sort of mutually as how we're running this podcast. So I mean, I can kick off with how I use LLMs when I'm doing my own channel. I would say I use them. I guess I don't know how to, I don't run a clock to see how many times I use them or not. But my typical thing is I have a ton of videos that I want to create. The ideas for the videos are not generative AI generated. You and I have joked about this before, that YouTube has a button you can click that will help you come up with ideas for your next video. And that's a great place to go if you want to know, don't make this video. Like, those ones all suck. There's never taken them from that pool. But then I will, when I have a topic that I want to talk about, I usually have some thesis. I'll write out like an outline, somewhere between an outline and a script. I'm a lot more stream of consciousness than you are, Carl, in sort of our general recording. And when I feel good about the script, sometimes I'll just go straight to recording it. But I think more and more now, I'm like, okay, I like that. I'll sit with it a day or so. And I often will shove that into an LLM and I'll be like, here's a script I'm making for my upcoming YouTube video on this channel. Give me an evaluation. And on occasion, they'll be like, you left out this sort of consideration or you did this other thing. So I use it as like a little bit of an interlocutor to say, is there something that looks particularly good or bad there? In the same way that I think it's kind of a grammar check of an email level of change, I think. It rarely changes things substantially. And I usually find if I get a lot of resistance from it, where I'm like, well, it gives me this objection and I don't know how to respond to it, I'm more likely to just scrap the whole thing and start something new from scratch and be like, yeah, okay, that's too far off. So I use it to that degree. And then the other times I use it are after I've made the video. I will again feed the script or outline in and say, come up with 5 title suggestions, my SEO hashtag terms, and a description that I can copy and paste. And then I get those things. I will read over them and make edits to them and put those things in. And I would say the titles, usually 1 title out of the 5 is okay. And I'll keep it as one of my 3. And then I'll come up with another couple of my own. So that's my LLM usage.
So I actually have on Internet of Bugs, AI_disclosure, I actually have a policy that I use for what I do on my personal channel. And that's actually what I do when I'm editing the videos for this podcast, for whatever that's worth. So I use AIs for suggesting descriptions, keywords, hashtags. I ask generally for the chapter, like what timestamps and what's the head of the summary of that section of the timestamp. I read over those, but generally what the AI comes up with is as good as what I would have put there. I don't, I'm not great at descriptions and that kind of thing. Its idea of what was in the podcast is, phrased about as well as what I would have said, I think. I will occasionally use AIs for thumbnails or for graphics inside thumbnails. Generally, that is a thing where if I wasn't doing that, the thumbnail would either just have my face or my face and text, or I would just like Photoshop in some logos or something like that, right? It's not like the only time I would use an AI for that kind of thing is if the alternative for that would have been, me doing it in a crappy way. Right. If the alternative to using the AI would be, if I couldn't get the AI to do this, I would have to pay somebody for it, then I'm going to pay somebody for it. So it's only, it makes it slightly less crappy than, my very poor Photoshop skill kind of things. Is the only time I really do it for that. I use AI for research, though, a lot. I use it for searching the web. I find that that searching with an LLM-based search does a better job of understanding and finding the right pages that I'm looking for, because it does a better job of understanding the context of what I'm asking for. It does a better job of like substituting synonyms and finding things that didn't actually have any of the words that I asked for, but had the right sentiment of what I asked for. I get very irritated when I say, find me articles that are blah, 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 and it like gives me a summary and I have to go click on the sources and go through the sources. But that's generally the way I do things. That's the way I find a lot of the sources for things. I will sometimes, so like with this Hugging Face AI kind of thing, Hugging Face OpenAI thing, I have a bunch of web pages, articles, transcripts, such that I've grabbed and put into Obsidian, which is the note-taking tool that I use. And then I will take the output, one of those folders of Obsidian things, and I will dump that into Notebook LLM, which is one of Google's things. And I will say, okay, so searching only the documents that I gave you, right? How many instances of there are people talking about this? How many times did this happen? Find me a quote about this, that kind of thing, right? And then I'll go and look. I don't actually, when I say, of these 50 articles, how many of them, mentioned, whatever, AI going rogue, right? And it says, okay, 11 of the 50 did. I'm not going to go count all of them necessarily. It sounds about right to me, right? So I could be off on that, but that's kind of what I use it for, because I know it's a lot less likely to hallucinate in the context that it's only using the documents that I gave it, and it's got, and it gives me references to the quotes and that kind of thing that inside the corpus of the stuff that I told it to look up. I do a lot of times speak about how well AI does things, a lot of times code, a lot of times not code. And so I feel like I ought to use it. I use a lot of like the coding agent kind of things because I want to be able to speak on my channel about the fact whether or not they're getting better, right? That's part of what people come to my channel for, is basically, wanting to know my opinion of the things. And if I don't use them, then I can't, be intelligent about that. But I have, I've developed my own voice. I've developed my own way that I write things over the course of, 35 years of status reports and business proposals and all that kind of crap. And so, for me, asking an AI to write the document isn't going to give me anything that I want. I've tried that before, and it's garbage. It doesn't, and it has no. It's kind of like those really crappy essays that they ask. Like I was talking to my daughter about at one point, where you're supposed to write in this essay a paragraph about this particular topic, and you can make up whatever facts you want. They're just trying to see if you can structure an argument, but the facts aren't actually important. That's a lot of what I get from the LLMs, which is very much not what I want to have on my channel. So I don't use LLMs for outlining or writing, or, I don't use them for, reading my script and pushing back of that kind of stuff. I use them to give me a transcript at the end. I always have to go back and edit this transcript by hand because they always screw up some things, especially like proper nouns. And they have a trouble when you say LLM, they have a problem. They call it, they end up making it LM or LEM or LOM or just a bunch of different words that they always screw up. OpenAI always ends up being two words. ChatGPT usually is ChatGB as in boy T and not P as in or whatever. But, but yeah, so I use them kind of extensively, but I never use them for ideas. When I've asked them for ideas, generally the ideas that I get are like things that aren't true, right? And I have a whiteboard over here that is literally full of overlapping sticky notes of all of the different ideas that I want to put in videos that I'll probably never get to. So I don't have a problem with figuring out what to make videos out of.
It's interesting that our uses are, I mean, there's the overlap of the hashtags or like, search optimization thing, which I think is a pretty obvious place to use it. Especially I tend to more to use Gemini for that.
Yeah.
Because I'm just banking on the fact that Google is doing a better job of having training data that will handle the kinds of things that will perform well on YouTube.
Gemini is also a lot better if you're wanting to find videos that you're going to like refute or you're going to use as evidence of things or whatever. Gemini is a lot better at finding YouTube videos than either YouTube search or any other thing that I've found.
Interesting.
For whatever that's worth.
Yeah, I haven't done that side as much. But yeah, in terms of like the back and forth on the, like some script ideas and stuff like that, I definitely do that more than you. I wonder how much that has to do with our different styles or predispositions or, any number of things might explain it. But we've talked about this in the past where just different people, you'll have different, virtues and vices. And I would expect good LLM use will hit you in a different spot because you have different skills that you need to augment or vices that you need to avoid. Yeah, but go ahead.
One other thing. I do use a service, an AI-based service, to do the final leveling of the audio on both my videos and the videos for this podcast. I have a lot of hearing damage from going hunting with my dad with a 12-gauge shotgun in the 70s, back before hearing protection was a thing, and decades of working inside data centers without hearing protection. So, I have had people complain before about the quality of the audios in my videos that I literally, with really good headphones on, could not hear because my ears just aren't that good anymore. So I actually pay a service to do AI, noise reduction and that kind of thing on both my audio and the audio for this podcast, for whatever that's worth. But I'm pretty sure that there's AI involved in that, although, I'm not using the AI myself, but I'm pretty sure the service does it. So,
right. And we have gone this far in the episode, a very long episode, without mentioning that people have different definitions of what AI is. So take that with all of this too, right? There might be different places that y'all would draw the line if you're, we have to disclose what AI usage is, and we're not even mentioning spell check as a thing.
right.
But in some sense, that's
Right.
you might consider that to be AI, and so then we would have to disclose it. You also had a really, I think, a good point about you and I are in sort of unique positions where we're content creators about artificial intelligence.
Right.
We say a lot about LLMs. And so we do have a responsibility to use them in our everyday lives to some degree if we are going to be able to speak intelligently about what they do. And so you're in this like catch-22 of the more that I use them, the more that my brain has been warped by the information they've given me. But if I don't use them and I tell you that I don't need them at all in my daily life, right? I had a flip phone for my entire life up until about a year ago.
Really?
Yeah. That was one of my defining characteristics. And then it finally died, and I asked for a new flip phone, and they're like, it'll be $500, or we can give you your phone will be like a free Google Pixel. Which one do you want? And I was like, why do I have to pay for the flip? I want the flip phone. So now I'm a smartphone guy. But this is just to say that I would give a lot of people flack about having to have their smartphones around everywhere, and like not having them gave me a bit of credibility because it's definitely giving me credibility with my daughter, who, well, she doesn't think so, but I'm like, you don't have to have a smartphone. And I didn't have one until I was like 37, 38. No, I guess, was I 39 when I had it? I'm old now. But I made it that long. You can make it to 20 or whatever the case is going to be. But yeah, how do we balance using it? We have to use a little bit, or at least we should disclose how we use it, and we have to be mindful of how are we balancing our getting the expertise and experience to use it without risking compromising the content that we make, or starting to say appreciate the pushback every other sentence and like destroying our own style, which is another thing that you brought up that I think is really good. We're like, you have established your own style at this point. That's partly why you don't use LLMs as much, because you want to write in that voice. But I think another piece to this, we've often mentioned kids being involved. You might want to be more hesitant to use these things if you're younger and you haven't yet established how you want to talk or think or speak about things. I think one of the reasons I don't mind bouncing my arguments off of an LLM is I don't think they're reshaping my brain all that strongly. Like I have very clear ways about how I want to formulate arguments, how I think is like the charitable way to reconstruct them. And often I get recommendations from the LLM, like, well, you could do that. Is like, no, that would be incorrect. And I wouldn't ever do it. And until you have your own conviction to do that, then it's more dangerous to use these LLMs, I think, in terms of just like washing out your own perspective.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is if you fall back on the LLMs a lot, right, what you end up with is that you're never going to get any better on your own.
Yeah.
Right. What you're doing is you're amplifying your ignorance. you are taking your inability to do a thing and you are depriving yourself of the opportunity to improve at that thing. So when you insist on, maybe insist is a strong word, but when you use an LLM consistently for a particular thing, make sure that that's a thing that you don't think that you want or care or need to be able to do on your own.
If I want to be a little, so I agree with the sentiment there. You might use it for something you've already established that you can do on your own well enough, and you're like, I don't need any more practice on that right now. But I'm a very big fan of the, use it or lose it. Like all these different things are like muscles that will atrophy. Right? So if you are really competent at coming up with titles for YouTube shows or something, and you do it all day long, and then you use an LLM to generate a couple of them at the end of the day, you're not really getting any worse at that. That's fine. But if you're someone, like you said, who's just always falling back on LLMs to do this thing for you, then you might no longer be as good at doing it.
Well, I mean, you're not, if you're letting it create the titles for you, you're not getting any worse at creating titles necessarily, but you're not getting any better, right? Or at least you're not going to get any better. You might learn something from the LLM and go, oh, it wouldn't have occurred to me to do that. But you're not going to get any better than the LLM does.
That's right.
Right. And so if you want to be exceptional, if you want to be able to do a better job than the LLM does, the lowest common denominator of whatever the skill is, right, then you're going to have to do it without the LLM.
Yeah, I guess a better way to say what I was trying to say is it's a trade-off. So anytime
Sure.
you're offloading the cognitive work to an LLM to do something, that might be worth it. You should say, like, what's the cost benefit here, right? Like, I don't have to think about that as much. I think that's where we both land on like the SEO hashtag terms. I would not be as good at generating SEO hashtags for my videos. I don't care one lick if I lose all ability to do that. I'm fine outsourcing that. And instead, I'm going to use that time to make my next video a little bit better or something, right? That's the kind of trade-off that I'm making.
And that particular thing, and there are a lot of things like this, that particular thing is a moving target, right? The terms that are valuable in SEO or AEO or GEO or whatever the hell, the terms that are valuable in that right now are entirely a function of what's rare and what's common and what's being searched for and that kind of stuff. And those change on a daily basis. So even if you were really good at that right now, what you know about that isn't necessarily going to be relevant in a week or 2 weeks or something like that. So, it's not necessarily something that's useful to try to get good at. And largely it's about querying and it's about, searching the data, which is something that you're never going to be able to do as well as an LLM is going to be able to do, or a search engine is going to be able to do.
Yeah. Okay. There's some listeners out there who have made it through this entire podcast to now, and kudos to you all. Or maybe you're just really appreciate our diverse opinions. One question for them, Carl. Do you think that they should write their own AI use policies? Is this a thing that most people should be doing or thinking about, or is this sort of more unique to content creators?
So if you are in a position where you are creating output for someone, right, whatever output means in this case, then I think, yes, you should probably have, some kind of policy. I don't think that it's necessary for the average person to decide how they're going to use LLMs or whatever, because the state of the art in what the LLM is good at is changing pretty constantly. And if you draw a line in the sand and say, I'm never going to use it for that, you better make really, really sure that that you picked is something that's not going to end up being something that you'll never be able to do well compared to what the LLM can do. Now, you might make a policy and then reevaluate it every once in a while, but I don't know that having an individual policy as just an individual seems a little overboard to me. But you're certainly I'm certainly not going to tell you not to, but it doesn't seem necessary to me.
So, I'll just go Socrates here and say that the unexamined life is not worth living, and not even in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way. That's just like, you should be careful and reflective about the decisions that you're making in your life, and you should know what sort of person that you are. So if you are contemplating whether it's okay for you to use LLMs for certain things, like, sit down, think about it for a little bit, try and say, is that consistent with the way that, like, my other principles and the things that I take a stand on? And like you said, you can always go back and revise those things as better and different information comes in. But yeah, I think it's worth it for you to spend at least a little bit of time. And as, again, we keep dancing around a little bit, I think it's especially important for folks who have kids to think about, what role am I going to let AI play around my children? Like, because that, I feel like, has more long-term implications for a whole bunch of different things. So if I did say you should have a policy about that kind of stuff, for most people, if you're a parent, you should have a policy of, like,
yeah, absolutely.
Talk with your partner about, like, wait, how are we raising our kids with respect to these things?
And don't be like Sam Altman.
Don't be like Sam Altman. I think that's a great alternative tagline. Maybe that'll be the title for this episode. Right. We'll see. All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thanks everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.